and Heather are here with Mair from sociology. So you've been active on the picket line during this UCU strike in Liverpool. Can you tell us what you think about the socio-economic role of trade unions in general?
Well, firstly, thanks very much for inviting me to an interview. It's a pleasure to talk about these things. And the socio-economic role of trade unions, I think, is a very important one, has been historically for a whole variety of reasons. In the 70s, trade union activity, well, if we go back to the 20s, trade union activity was essential in organising the labour movements. It's not just about the immediate outcomes, it's the way in which that lays a basis for solidarity, which then becomes a basis for pursuing progressive kind of social change, particularly redistributive policies in the kind of governmental sphere. In the UK, of course, we had the 1970s where we saw an uptick in a lot of industrial action, and then since then industrial action has tailed off massively, partly as a result of some of the most draconian labour laws and anti-trade union laws anywhere in the European Union. What's really noticeable about that is that's coincided with a massive increase in socio-economic inequality in British society. It's also actually now coinciding with a society which is very low in productivity, where there are lots of people in work, but the work they do doesn't produce very much. So our economy is not functioning well. It's producing a lot of inequality, it's producing a lot of poverty, but it's not seeming to do much else. When we look around the world at societies which have got much higher levels of trade union density, as the term is, what we see is quite a different picture. That seems that, contrary to the mantra that we've been sold in the UK since the late 1970s and early 1980s, societies which have higher trade union density have actually higher levels of social equality and also higher levels of productivity. So these are economies which function better, and they function better because they work for everybody. They don't generate inequality and they don't generate poverty in the levels that we see in the UK. Interestingly, and as I mentioned to you ahead of the interview, this has now been noticed by the International Monetary Fund, which has been one of the most neoliberal institutions over the last 30 years and has imposed huge amounts of damage worldwide, including draconian anti-trade union laws. So the sorts of laws that we see in the UK are very much according to the rulebook that the IMF established in the 1980s. But now they're withdrawing from that, and they're saying that inequality is the biggest problem facing economies around the world in the 21st century, and trade unions are key to establishing that. So very active trade unions are actually really good for society, and that makes it more depressing that universities, which have been a place where this sort of knowledge has been documented, where understandings of trade union activity and its role in social policy have been kind of analysed and made sense of, that its universities are actually taking these incredibly kind of aggressive measures against the employment rates of its own staff.
It was interesting that you mentioned the IMF article, because it distinguishes at the end between good inequality and bad inequality, and says that some economists would see the increase in top earners' income as a sign of increased productivity, whereas you've explained that it's exactly the opposite. So in this case it would be a situation of bad inequality and rent extraction.
Yes.
So in this sense, how does the UCU justify its proposals in the pensions and the increase in income of the high executives?
I suppose there's UCU is looking at a kind of pension scheme for its members. There are some very well paid academics. Academics are well paid relative to the rest of society. That's certainly true, but they're not massively well paid. They're not anywhere near the same level as doctors, mostly, and as a result, a lot of our pension is deferred wages. So our wages are taken out and we're put into a pension fund, which then comes back. The idea is that we would defer wages, our own wages, the money we put into the system, and then not get it back via the new employment proposals, which seems frankly absurd. That's not a deal anybody's going to take under these circumstances. So yes, certainly, I think one of the things about the pensions is, and I think this is which speaks beyond the UCU strike, is that what we've seen since 2007, 2008, the financial crisis, is an attack in the private sector on decent pensions. Now the UK has one of the lowest pensions in the whole of the club of the advanced capitalist nations of the OECD. That is terrible. The state pension guarantees poverty, essentially. It will not take you above the poverty line. If you take the equivalent, I was looking this up actually. So if obviously this is the maximum state pension in the UK is, I'll just check that exact figure, it's £122.30 a week. That's if you have full contributions across your lifetime. The maximum pension in Germany is €67,200 a year. Oh, that's the state-backed and guaranteed occupational pension for the whole of that society. In the United States, if you pay in, the maximum monthly benefit is $2,639 a month. So even the Americans are paying out 4 to 5 to 6 times as much as the UK is in terms of a state pension. Now, the basic understanding post-war was then that if the state pension is not going to be enough for MD to have a decent standard of living in old age, that would always be topped up by occupational pensions, which in some respects were backed by the state across most sectors. The state has kind of withdrawn a lot of that underlying fiscal support, and as a result, all of the pensions in the private sector have shut down. Now that's pushed people in the private sector into all sorts of risky investments. You know, not just Bitcoin recently, probably some people have blown bits of their pension pot trying to get into the Bitcoin gold rush, but property speculation. It's it's very noticeable that at a time when social insecurity as a result of declining pension rates, property starts to take up an increasingly important role in people's saving for retirement. But as to young people, you're going to be looking for houses of your own at some point, but if they've all been bought up by your parents, and your lecturers, because they're looking for some kind of security in old age, you'll never get onto the property ladder. You'll never have access to those sorts of things. So we're already, even if you buy into, we don't make housing in other ways available either. So we're actually clogging up the system in all sorts of crazy counterproductive ways as a result of the changes that we've made to people's lives. It's much cleaner and simpler in a way to use the government to help us back not just good, decent pensions in the public sector, but also in the private sector.
Do you think that the marketisation of the university, it's the union backlash to it? Do you think that's showing the discrepancy of the logic of marketisation because it's not being productive and stuff like that?
Absolutely. So in a way, so if you think you can take the issue of pensions and the treatment and how that extends outwards, but I think just in terms of the issues of this particular strike, yes, it's absolutely, when marketisation reaches its absolute limits. This is one of the most aggressive moves undertaken by any employer on its employees' pension rates, and did quite well in the public sector. And it shows the degree of it shows the degree that the employers are willing to sacrifice their staff in pursuit of profit. The model is fairly clear. What you do is you raise costs on the commodity that you're selling, you reduce employment rights, you reduce wages, and you also reduce the quality of service. So the education that you're getting is not better than it was in the 1980s or 1990s or 2000s. In many respects, a lot of the people that you will have been taught by will be on casualised temporary contracts, themselves very anxious and insecure. And while no doubt they're very good at doing their job, so I would want to impugn anybody, nonetheless that's not the way things used to be. So what we're seeing is massive amounts of money being made by treating education as a fictitious commodity, but it's not a real commodity. When you start to treat it like a commodity, it starts to break because it doesn't function that way. And I think the reason why there's been such a reaction to this is not just because of the assault on the pensions, which is enough in its own right. It's because people are so concerned by the nature of the moves in contemporary universities that we're actually losing the idea of education as a public good, as something which people can pursue for reasons other than employability, entrepreneurship, and all of these other things, that there may be some value in knowledge in whatever form it might take, and that people might pursue it for its own right. So yes, I think this speaks to what is a university, what's it for, where's it going, and I think in the past UCU has engaged in sort of symbolic action, limited action, and people engaged in it in a symbolic way. As soon as UCU came out with one of the most extended periods of striking in UK higher education ever, that's galvanised people. There's been more support for this strike than there has been for the smaller, symbolic strikes in the past, and I think that shows that not just us and the support from the students has been absolutely amazing, because the students' issues with higher education and our issues with higher education are the same sets of issues. They're not different, they're just two sides of the same coin, and having that sort of growing sense of connection between both parts is so important for what's coming next.
Yeah. Perhaps that's why people who don't understand this sort of education point of view are sort of so surprised at the student turnout. So what have the UCU's proposals been, do you think, how radical have they been?
Well, that's the crazy thing about contemporary Britain, is that things which are not actually very radical at all get treated as if Stalinists have taken over and have demanded all sorts of things. So it's definitely not the case. And actually, I think that portrayal has broken in this case. You've got the Conservatives, you've got the Daily Telegraph, you've got the Times supporting the lecturers in the strike, the university staff, I should say, because this is not just about lecturers, this is all about administrators in the university, and them coming out in support of the strike as well is absolute, because they support education too. It's not simply about those who are in the teaching roles. So I don't think it's particularly radical. I think where the radicalism actually lies is with the employers. They are being radical, and they're being radical in ways which they feel empowered by the fact that they've become asset management companies to a large extent. Most of the money that's being generated around campuses in the UK, in fact in North America, and as well, is around asset management, student accommodation, providing bases for other people to do certain types of activity. And that's not what anybody thinks a university should be, but that should be accommodation service at ultra high rents as a basis for basically making a profit and capital. So yes, I think it's them who are being radical rather than the UCU, and actually it's quite interesting to see how many Vice-Chancellors have come out strongly in support of their own staff and against the UUK position, which shows you these are people who've been in institutions, they are very well paid, even they see what's happening as completely unacceptable. So yes, there's a real problem with what UUK, and I think it's actually, if the Conservatives have said you've gone too far, then I think we're at a position where we need to kind of really put the spotlight on them rather than the industrial action. I think is a completely logical response to what's happened. Where I think we can be more radical going forward is to create the lines of support for students, to create lines of support around the student tuition fees, which is really where the scandal in contemporary British education is, because that's the money that they've been using in order to fuel their asset speculations in a whole variety of ways. So we would, I think, as a union, we also need to think about how we now support others in challenging that environment which has been created.
Do you think those sort of suggestions might start to crop up as student support has sort of been shown to be so strong?
Definitely. I mean, I think one of the things being the picket line for the first 5 days, everybody's so genuinely sort of moved to see the students around and supporting them. And I think actually that student support's added extra impetus and drive to the strike itself, because people can see that if students who in some respects have been structurally opposed to us within this system of higher education, or which the universities have attempted to structurally oppose to us, can come out in support of us in our strike, that just galvanises us to go out and make sure that we make an impact and win this and start, if you like, the process of changing higher education in a more positive way.
The UUK has said they're going to start negotiating again. Do you think these suggested negotiations have been meaningful? Obviously, maybe they will start better negotiations in the future, but for now, up to last weekend, it seems to be that they've not really addressed the actual issue.
Yes, I mean, I think it's fair to say that they initially thought they would do to us what they did to the junior doctors last year, which is get the junior doctors were coaxed into breaking their strike action, and then they found it impossible to get it going again, even though basically they then had to fall in line with the government's imposed changes. This time, I think the union leadership have realised that that's precisely what's going on. The leaked email from St Andrews last weekend by Alistair Jarvis. So Alistair Jarvis has a fairly senior position in UK's negotiating team is meant to be independent, but was head of the CBI. So we've got somebody who's head of the board, the chair of the board of investors, who's there to essentially argue the business case. And you can see the moves, in some respects, why the move seems so radical is because only people who thought of universities as corporations would proceed to do the sorts of things that have been done in the private sector. So it shows you where university management's head is, or at least a small hardcore of universities' heads are at. They believe they're now operating corporations. The shame, the sad thing is they're not really as able or capable as the people, the people out there are trained in these sorts of things, where these are people who've come at it and are largely doing some quite scary and potentially dangerous things with their property portfolios and things like that. But yes, sorry, to go back to the union negotiation, I think we're alive. We're going to be going on strike for 4 days next week without breaking the strike, and then as far as we're aware, as far as we're concerned, we're then out for 5 days at the end, and then thereafter it's going to be rolling strike action. Some universities are already putting a lot of pressure on academics to do replacement activity. I think a very strong stance locally, both at department, school, faculty, etc. level, where we say we're not going to meet the demands of management, that this is part of our industrial action too, and then they can take us collectively, whereas they'll try and have individualising tactics, as is always the case in any industrial action, and pick people off one by one. So I think it's very important that we maintain our collective solidarity within the university in the coming weeks too.
With the focus on the finances, do you think the dialogue about the investment of pensions is going to open up more between lecturers and students with the university about where certain money in the university is going? Because certainly with different teach outs, especially with one about the global arms trade run by David White, they were talking about the global arms trade and maybe relations between universities and this trade, but then they were talking about why they're looking at where money goes. Do you think that this union action will help with that dialogue?
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things which is probably overdue, universities are medieval institutions, and even the newer universities inherited this kind of medieval mantle, hence the strange garb that everybody wears, and medieval institutions were not notorious for their transparency. Whereas I think, again, when you've got, it wasn't the best documentary in the world earlier on this week, about the Vice-Chancellor's expenses, but one of the points was that universities now have to embrace transparency. Obviously, the 9,000 fees, as I've mentioned to most of the student groups that I get, that doesn't come from the student loans company. The student loans company is a debt holding point. It's a financialised entity which is created as the kind of holding place for debt, with obviously a chief executive who makes huge amounts of money and the rest of it. That money comes from government. So that money is coming, there's more money going into higher education directly from government than at any point over the past 30 years. There's been no desire to have any accountability around that whatsoever. I think we badly need accountability. If it would seem reasonable in a place of learning to suggest that knowledge should be open and that we should be able to scrutinise the workings of the very places that we are a part of. That's certainly the case increasingly with us. We are some of the most monitored academics in the entire world now. We have a range of regimes which we must meet and show our accountability every couple of months. We have to show we're doing enough research. We have to show that our teaching meets certain qualities. We have to show that our administrative activities are all online. That often takes up more than the days in the week. We work at weekends, we work in the evenings. The reverse, that symmetrical requirement on university management rarely have demands arisen for them to have the same accountability requirements that they require of all of their staff. So I think this is absolutely the time where new accountability regimes. I'm not sure the Office for Students is the correct entity for that. I think it's partly about there being more local control. But certainly, yes, we need a lot more accountability about where the money's going. So you can actually scrutinise and see what the university's spending its money on.
Yeah, I think it was some students from our university that interviewed Jo McNeill, is she the leader of the UCU branch here? Yeah.
Yes.
I think it was her they interviewed, and she was like talking about the impact of like financialisation of universities on research and stuff, saying that it does limit what lecturers can and can't do quite a lot. So yeah, could you go more into detail with that, because I don't fully understand how that works.
So we we get scrutinised every 7 years in terms of the research that we do through what's now called the Research Excellence Framework, and people who are doing small scale research, which is perhaps excellent in its own way, but speaks to perhaps a niche of people rather than a wider group, they find it very difficult to survive in a context which requires you to produce a lot in very high profile spaces where you reach the biggest audiences and get the biggest share. So the social sciences as a whole suffer in comparison to the natural sciences. So if you are somebody who writes for Nature, I think Nature Cancer is the highest impact journal in the world, or was until recently. I'm never going to have a paper. One paper in Nature Cancer would make my entire career, but I'm never going to have it because it's so much a higher impact. So there's more citations per paper in Nature Cancer than there is in any of the journals in the social sciences. The social sciences are slower, they're longer term, they're often smaller scale, and often they're free. In this context, that kind of research doesn't look very good and can be problematised. And it's not just it's not just in this university, it's across all universities. So for that research to really be supported, it's very difficult. So to an extent, we can imagine a space where only social science and arts and humanities research, which is supportive of big industrialised areas of research in a university, would be, if you like, validated, whereas all of the rest would be pushed out. Under the current arrangements, all of those who engage in that kind of research would probably find themselves in teaching-only contracts, so they wouldn't have research built into their contracts, and that's a more vulnerable position than a research position. So yes, it's very problematic. It squeezes those who perhaps do very novel and interesting research, but it's smaller scale and doesn't speak to a whole range of concerns. And I find that really close-minded. So we have a colleague here who gave one of the teach-outs this week, Gottfried Kroenen, and he does digital markups of medieval texts. Now, those medieval texts will not have a lot of readers. This is a fairly niche, but actually the skills that he's developed by doing that, just out of interest, out of trying to make accessible his scholarship on this particular, have now become the centre of contemporary social science, and also, in fact, lots of natural science and other subjects aside. So 15 years ago, under the criteria that are in place now, Gottfried could have been looking like a very problematic individual within the contemporary scene, but now his scholarship and all the rest of it looks like it's at the forefront of learning in the current world. So if you take a very narrow and short-sighted view, which is based upon short-term profit, organised around indicators, KPIs as they're known, key performance indicators, you push out the things which will be the basis of knowledge in the future, and that's very, again, that goes against, for me, the idea of what a university is, which is to support and promote knowledge across all of its manifestations. Whether you agree with it or not, actually, I think this has to be a place where there's room for debate and people to pursue things which other people may see no value in, because I'm sure if you change your perspective, that can come back to you. So I think as a space where all of that stuff happens, I think that's really important.
The final thing I wanted to ask was, you were talking about how like similar things have been done to the NHS last year and now with the universities. Do you think if the UCU are successful in doing what they want to do with the pensions, do you think that might be a start towards similar schemes in other sectors?
Yes, I mean, I think we need to go back. Actually, NHS staff themselves have a much better pension scheme than university staff, and because it's bigger, because it extends across the UK, it's very unlikely yet that there would be a move in their pension scheme. Similarly with teachers and similarly with the local government pension scheme. but there's other ways in which that's been done so far. So you can actually see it at work in the university. One way of cutting costs is not to put people in a position where they qualify for pension rates. And that's what we've been seeing more and more. So one of the things about the NHS is the rise of the private finance initiative, and what happens in the private finance initiative is often the people who worked in a building, so take the Royal Liverpool Hospital, for example, what will happen when that building eventually opens is all of the staff who worked in the old Royal will be transferred over to the new Royal. All of those staff who are transferred over will have the same rights. There's a transfer agreement, so their rights will be carried over. But the staff, as they slowly go to retirement or leave to go to other forms of work, they will be replaced by people who don't have access to NHS contracts, but are on casualised, temporary, often 0 hour, and many other forms of precarious and insecure employment. We see that at work in the university as well. One of the things which has happened over the last few days, for instance, is we've had in the university the sight of private security guards, who I'm sure both of you saw around. So those private security guards are brought into the university to look after the library between the hours of 6 and 9 in the morning. They work on minimum wage, but often because they're not entitled to breaks and the like, they are working below minimum wage. They also look after the university halls and a variety of other things besides. Instead of paying time and a half, double time, overtime to existing staff who do have access to pensions. So all of those guys who've been brought in to police the strikers, the pickets, are people who have no employment rights whatsoever. And that's indicative of the ways in which institutions are increasingly moving. Rather than pay the costs of the core activities, which is, I take it, and security guards do have a role on campus, they certainly do, rather than pay the costs for security where you need it, you casualise it, farm it out, outsource, contracting and all the rest of it. So in the same way that Carillion and many other PFI providers, or Capita more recently, have run into serious difficulties or collapsed, I think universities have to be very careful about this contracting model that they've started to build. So for me, I think that's one area. And students like yourselves, of course, some of you will go off and work in all sorts of sectors, and that's brilliant, and hopefully the education you get while you're at university carries with you. Some of you will go into academia, and it's increasingly difficult to say with any confidence that you'll be able to secure permanent, full-time work with decent employment rights. So that's been driven right into the heart of teaching as well, that casualisation, contracting, an insecure model. So I think across the economy in Britain as a whole, and this is where trade unions, to go back to the very first question, are so important. We need to create decent work again for everyone, and trade unions are critical to ensuring that good work gets created across the economy.
Yeah, I was interested in the IMF article you sent me. It was also saying that it's a myth that higher levels of, like, increasing the minimum wage leads to increasing more unemployment. Yeah, and it said there's no evidence for that.
None at all.
Yeah.
A lot of the economic logic, which we're told, is very much stems from a mythical or ideological perspective on the economy, which is, we think if we give high levels of benefits to people and good employment rights, they will take advantage of that and start, you walk into my office, there'll be a sunbed, I'll be drinking champagne and all the rest of it, as opposed to feeling a valued member of the society and working very hard to pay back the trust which I've got from everybody else. If you're in Scandinavia, they see that as part of the course, they see that kind of trust and the fact that you're in a collective endeavour as just an article of faith. It's taken for granted. So it's something peculiar about us and our suspicion of one another, and I think the position we're partly in now with the change between the Cameron-Osborne years, where a huge amount of suspicion and distrust was created, and particularly this kind of weaponisation of a language of fairness. So the whole thing was, these people who are getting so much more than you, is it fair that they have a higher pension than you? And rather than saying, no, it's not fair that I don't get that pension, so when am I getting that pension? They said, okay, we'll take that pension away from those. Everybody moves down. So they managed to sell that. That's now colliding with the realities of what's happening right now. Jeremy Corbyn and Theresa May, for all of her involvement in the Brexit stuff, they actually align on a number of points around what the state should do, the need for security, greater security for people. They obviously have completely different recipes for what happens, but I think we're seeing a new alignment in British politics of what will be some of the main points of political contest in coming years. And I think the universities have found themselves on the wrong side of both, which is quite remarkable. And you think if you're going to pay somebody that much money to run your university, they might have been a bit more savvy about the political context they were running into when trying these sorts of things.
Yeah, well, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.